minhas amigas e meus amigos. É uma alegria muito grande recebê-las e recebê-los aqui nesse lugar.
With us in a place where we've had many events from Erie. We have a full house this morning, and we're going to talk about a very important topic for Brazil. Brazil has a very close bond, sometimes a tense relationship with the US. So the US elections affect Brazil significantly. They are important for Brazil, and they need to be looked at very carefully. This morning, we have a very important guest who is deeply involved with the US elections. He was the mayor of New York City. He left a deep mark. He is progressive, he's a Democrat. He understands his country very deeply and also these elections because he's playing a significant role in Biden's campaign. Biden is the direct contender against Donald Trump. And we know whatever happens, either if Biden or Trump wins, this will have consequences for Brazil. And we want to understand what is happening in the US. We want to understand their political dynamic and how they are getting prepared for the electoral campaign. The American model is very different from ours. So we wanted to hear from Mayor de Blasio about what will happen in the US and what will happen to Brazil as it happens in the US. I'm going to speak to him in English. We're going to have a conversation. And in order to do that, I'm going to use my English, which will make it easier to interact with him. You have headsets available if you'd like to listen to the translation in Portuguese if you prefer. I'm sure you will understand his English perfectly, but mine is probably not so good. So, the one and only Bill de Blasio.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I think that we could start our talk having some impressions from you of this thing that is very important for your country and for our country, since we relate for so long and we have such an intimate and sometimes tense relationship, Brazil and the United States. So please, tell us.
Thank you so much. Walfredo, thank you. And I'd like to stand just to open up and say a few words, and then you and I will have our dialogue. So everyone, good morning, bom dia. I'm so thankful for the chance to speak with you. And I also am very thankful because of Walfredo, I've had the chance now to begin to understand better the issues of Brazil and certainly of Sao Paulo. And to me, this is an extraordinary, meaningful moment in my life because this country I've admired from far away as someone involved in the political process, as someone who cares about how we create a more just and equal society. Many things here have been inspiring to me. I know there's many challenges as well. But it's been because of Walfredo I've had the opportunity now to begin to have a small involvement here, and I thank you very, very much for that. It means so much to me. And the conference, I have to say, the conference in Brasilia a few weeks ago was very moving to me because we talked about how we make reform, how we make change, and this is something we work on every single day in the United States of America and in New York City, and we have a long way to go. So there's a humility that comes with trying to find that path to a society that functions better, to a society that treats its people better. There's a humility because it's a work no one on earth has perfected. Every one of us is experimenting. But I saw some amazing things in Brasilia, and I appreciate the gathering deeply. Very quickly, if you are confused by the politics of the United States of America, I'm here to tell you, you are normal. We are confused also about our own politics. We're confused, so many of us, by the situation we find ourselves in. And I don't think anyone could have easily predicted the dynamics of the United States right now. And we're all still trying to make sense of it. And to make it more interesting, the things that we used to believe we could depend on, like public opinion polling, for example, have become less and less accurate, less and less meaningful. A lot of the norms, the norms of discourse, the sort of civil norms have obviously changed. But what hasn't changed is the fundamental interest that people have, everyday people, in trying to determine who, which candidate, which party will do more for them in their lives. And I emphasize that question, who will take care of me, who represents my interests, who understands me, is even more pertinent after the COVID pandemic. I think what's interesting is so much of the political analysis in the United States does not reference the pandemic, even though the pandemic was a seismic event that reached every household in America and changed people and left them feeling vulnerable and confused. And the amount of human pain and loss was immense. We have not processed it. We have not really fully understood what that means for our lives and our politics yet. But what we can certainly say is the American people right now are restive, they are dissatisfied, they're worried. That I'm a Democrat, as Walfrido said, I'm a partisan Democrat, I support Joe Biden, but I can say openly and honestly, I see how much pain, how much confusion, how much fear is being felt in the American electorate. That does not mean they necessarily choose Donald Trump because he speaks in a different way to that fear. In fact, I would argue, in an uncertain world, in a complicated world, I think in many ways people will find Joe Biden ultimately reassuring. And this is the fascinating dynamic we're seeing playing out right now. And of course, tonight will be essential with the debate. And I'll say something about that in a moment because it was a very interesting choice by the Biden team, and I want to tell you why I think they did it. But very quickly, I believe what's really happening in this election is at this point of tremendous uncertainty, many American voters will sort of come home to some of the norms that we did depend on and relied on effectively. This election will ultimately be decided by a very small number of a very specific group of people. And I will tell you this, I believe this in my core. I have worked behind the scenes on campaigns, including on presidential campaigns. I have been an elected official. I ran for president of the United States in the 2020 campaign cycle. It's very important. Walfrido didn't tell you this. I did not win that election. I'm not president. Didn't work out. But, but I did. I debated Joe Biden and all the others, Kamala Harris, all of them. Here's what this election, here's who will decide this election. A very small group of people, several million people. They are women. They live in suburban areas in 6 states. They are moderates politically. A number of them are independent voters, meaning not a member of Democratic or Republican Party, and some of them are, in fact, Republicans who will bolt the Republican Party and go to Joe Biden. Overwhelmingly on the issue of abortion, but not just. The issue of abortion is, I think, the seismic political development over the last few years. We've seen that play out in a number of elections around the United States of America in 2022, 2023, 2024. Extremely consistent results. Women voters, including more moderate women, including independent and Republican women, moving to the Democratic side because their rights were taken away by Donald Trump. It is the first instance in American history of a major right being removed, being stolen. Do not underestimate what that means, not just to women who are at the age they might have children themselves, but to their mothers and their grandmothers. So that group of women will decide the election, and I believe they'll decide the election in favor of Joe Biden. I also think that group of women and some voters beyond that group will be deeply affected by that desire to see a leader who can somehow navigate the world. The Republicans, of course, have tried to present Joe Biden as old and frail. The facts are otherwise. He's run a very capable administration with actually an extraordinary amount of achievement. I wish sometimes Joe Biden presented things differently, but you cannot take away the achievements and the ability. And therefore, why did they choose the debate? Because in the end, the Republicans set a trap for themselves by insisting that Joe Biden was no longer capable. Joe Biden's team understood that they could go into that debate and with a reasonably strong performance, turn the dynamics of the election in their favor for now. Long road ahead, but that they could gain advantage now. Also, I can say from my own experience, Joe Biden happens to be very strong at debate. And when focused, can be a very effective messenger. So the Democrats saw opportunity to do something counterintuitive and go for an early debate to give themselves a jolt and build momentum. Risky. No one knows what's going to happen tonight. I will tell you right now, in the United States of America, tens of millions of people are very tense this morning, worried that tonight might go the other way. But I actually think it was a brilliant strategy because they saw that the Republicans had painted such a perfect picture of a president out of touch and unable to make the most basic decisions. Joe Biden will have to do very little, in a sense, to win tonight. Finally, I've thought about this. I've been doing some interviews recently on American television because I did have that opportunity to debate Joe Biden, and people have consistently asked, what would you do if you were in his shoes facing Donald Trump? And I said, this is so wonderful because when you're a debater, it's beautiful to have a simple game plan, a simple strategy. Donald Trump, everyone knows, historically, he has the personality of a bully. And when someone has that type of personality, the one thing they do not handle well is being affronted aggressively. The bully expects to be deferred to or feared. Biden understands how to debate Trump. He understands to be very aggressive, focused. That gives him an immediate advantage. If Trump is loud and extreme, that hurts him with those very same women I mentioned. If he attempts to be mild and soft, it's fake, it's artificial. He doesn't have a good path. But Biden gets to say, Donald Trump, you're a convicted felon. This is a brand new factor in this election. You're a convicted felon, and to many, many Americans, including moderate and conservative voters, having been found guilty by an American jury is a huge issue. Very important. If I'm in Joe Biden's shoes, I'm Donald Trump, you're a convicted felon. You took away the rights of women. You gave huge tax breaks to the wealthy and corporations. These are so many powerful, simple ideas. I think Biden has a wealth of opportunity tonight in terms of the attack lines and the strategies. So, again, I don't want to overstate. It is, anytime you talk about debate, anything can happen. But I'll conclude by saying, I appreciate, as someone who has campaigned, I appreciate deeply when a campaign wants to take the initiative, wants to go on the offensive, wants to take risk. Winning campaigns almost always take risks. This was a very important sign to see that the Biden campaign was not going to attempt what is called in American politics a rose garden strategy, which is to stay back and try and let your achievements speak for you. That certainly would not have worked in this election. Their decision to debate shows me an aggressive, creative approach, which is exactly what will be needed for them to win. I feel very good about what's going to happen tonight. That said, this will be a very, very, very close election. It will hinge on a very few states. It will go down to the very few, the few last days of the election, unquestionably. But What I'm seeing, even with the decision to debate tonight, gives me hope. And those overall dynamics I mentioned give me hope. And the last thing I'll say, and this is sort of a beautiful ending because it's very human. Candidates who are not hungry lose. Joe Biden already has been in these crucial states that we need to win. He's been there many, many times already. It's only June. He has been out there in the places he needs to be with that energy that he's saying to the voters, I need you. And if you don't do that, nothing else works. He's doing that in the way we need. And that gives me a lot of hope. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
As you mentioned, there's a lot of people feeling that was set aside by democracy, that the politicians privileged themselves and the rich, despite of the poor. Mm-hmm. It's a sort of malaise against democracy and politics overall. We feel the same. We see the same here in Brazil and in many places. How do you think your electoral system, the American electoral system, based on an electoral college to elect a president differently from governors and legislators? You have a very particular and indirect way of choosing a president. How does it play a role in order to improve a representation crisis in America?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Walfredo. The electoral college system creates immense challenges. It is not democratic with a small d. It's not a good version of democracy today. We understand in the post-revolutionary dynamic of the United States of America, 250 years ago, why, as a matter of compromise, the electoral college system was created. Because there was an uneasy alliance between the states, very different interests, north, south, and that was a way of getting agreement. It may have been a fine system 250 years ago. It is a broken system today. Hillary Clinton defeated Donald Trump by 3.5 million votes, and yet could not take the presidency. Even before, in the year 2000, Al Gore defeated George W. Bush by 500,000 votes, could not take the presidency. Thankfully, in 2020, Joe Biden won the Electoral College strongly, but the margin is so important, 7 million votes plus. Joe Biden won by over 7 million votes. But had they not been distributed properly, he still might have lost the Electoral College. So the system is absolutely broken. It will take a long time to fix because the nature in the United States of achieving a constitutional amendment is extremely cumbersome. It will be fixed one day, I believe, but not anytime soon. The tidbit I will offer, the little special strategic point, which is often neglected in the United States, and I'm sure it may not be front and center in the minds of people looking at America from around the world, is what could fundamentally change the entire reality of the United States, probably in about 10 years, give or take, is the state of Texas is slowly trending towards the Democratic Party. Lots of things, lots of people moving into Texas from other states who are more from a Democratic background, also demographic change within Texas. If Texas flips Democratic in presidential elections, America changes long-term because it's such a big piece of the Electoral College equation. So, yes, the system's broken, but it may actually course correct in a strange way if that happens because that will align the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. Last thing I'll say, your point about people feeling malaise, disconnect. I'm proud to be a Democrat in the context of our American partisan system, but Democrats are just as guilty as Republicans for allowing this malaise. Because the Democratic Party up until the 1970s had such a strong allegiance from working class people who felt their interests were truly represented by Democrats, starting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, all the way to John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. And I think Democrats fell victim to that elitism and that sense that they became more about Washington and power and position and money and not about the interests of everyday people. And there would not be a Donald Trump had Democrats stayed consistent with the tradition that had not only been very good for governance, but had won them elections for almost half a century. This is why Bernie Sanders had the impact he had, because he reached back to that history so effectively.
You mentioned some traits of personality of former President Trump. You said he's a bully.
Yes.
But are we sure of who exactly is Donald Trump? Because if we go back to the history of his first election, we will see that he was at the end of the pool. He was, not an important candidate. But suddenly he connected to Steve Bannon and Cambridge Analytica, and he coupled with a new technology, a new way of doing elections or running elections, and understood that social media, that internet, was a key instrument, and that he could, as Chris Willey, one of Cambridge Analytica guys, once told to me, he could make a specific speech for each group in social media. So, does America know who Trump is? And it is easier right now to disguise who you are in order to win elections.
Yeah. We see this in so many situations. I think your analysis is correct. Right now Trump is looking at different candidates for vice president. And one of my favorite examples is the senator from Ohio, J.D. Vance, who's the epitome of what you said. He has some of the best anti-Trump quotes of anyone, Republican or Democrat, from when Trump first was running. He now treats Trump almost as a Jesus Christ-like figure. And so the wonderful ability of people to change and get away with it, because that same social media dynamic allows for, when you take on the new personality, you can amplify it so constantly, people believe to some extent that is the truth. And that's the story of Donald Trump. Donald Trump desperately wanted, when he got married to Melania, desperately wanted Hillary Clinton to attend the wedding. This is long before they ran against each other. But he wanted the status of having the Clintons at his wedding. And Donald Trump was openly pro-choice, pro-abortion rights. Donald Trump gave a huge amount of money to the Democratic Party. I have never liked him. I've never felt, going back many years, I've never felt this was a person with any actual belief structure. But his opportunism led him to all those positions that I just mentioned. And then when the opportunity emerged in 2015 to run for president, that same opportunism led him to Cambridge Analytica and to the right wing and all the other things that we see today. We do know, going back to the 1980s, we do know that Donald Trump is a committed racist. It's not hard to see in everything he has said for years. There's a few strands of consistency, but very few. But this Donald Trump that he has decided to be, this is the one he's committed to. He can't turn back. It's interesting. I had an experience when he was elected. Many people know that election night in the general election of 2016, the projections overwhelmingly favored Hillary Clinton. I was at Hillary's headquarters for the victory party, what was presumed to be a victory party. And even well into the evening, everyone believed that the polling, all the facts that we thought we had would eventually lead to a victory. Finally, it became clear things were going the wrong way. And someone came over to me that night, a businessman in New York came over to me and said, "You're going to have to figure out how to navigate Donald Trump, but you're also going to have to figure out how to reassure New Yorkers because they're going to be extremely scared of what might be." So I tried to do both, but one of the things I realized was, maybe Trump in office maybe would be different than the rhetoric and the message. Maybe he would moderate. So I went to see him about 10 days after the election at Trump Tower. And a part of me, even though I was so angry that he had won and so deeply opposed to so much of what he had said, a part of me wanted him to lean toward me and say, "Don't worry, Bill. That's just what I had to do to win the election. But I'm going to govern very practically." Part of me wanted that for America and for New York. Instead, what I got was someone who would have moments of lucidity and then moments of absolute surrealism. And it was like, I'm talking a one-on-one meeting. This is where someone can be, they don't have to pretend. And I remember vividly, he told me at one point, he said a very sane, practical, normal sentence and then followed it with, "And you know that 3 million people voted illegally." And which, as we know, every study, including by Republicans, has proven to be false. So my point is, I think there was a time when Donald Trump could have moderated. I think had he moderated going into office in 2017, he actually could have been a reasonably effective and popular president. But he chose a path and then has doubled down. And I think we shouldn't forget that the worst extremism is from January 6, 2021 to present. In fact, everything that we thought was appalling and troubling up until January 6 pales in comparison to January 6, 2021 and since. And this is why I think with that crucial group of moderate voters, he continues to disqualify himself.
You mentioned that Biden has a strong argument tonight because Trump is a convicted felon.
Yes.
But the fact is that your legal system tried to fight against Trump in a different way that was chosen by our system. We have lots of analogies, lots of similarities. We had our Capitol Day here too, on January the 1st. And our electoral legal system banned Bolsonaro from elections. But your system couldn't do that and just created or displayed a electoral crime, but could not avoid the people of the United States to vote in Trump. Here, our legal system, it is accused to interfere in democracy and people's will. What do you think about that? Your system or our system?
Well, I like your system. Now, look, interestingly enough, in legislatures in the United States, including in the United States Congress, an indictment alone typically leads to the possibility of someone being removed, certainly a conviction. The notion that someone could be convicted and still continue to run for president is outlandish. Yes, he has a right to appeal. I want to be fair. But it makes no sense, and nowhere in the American political tradition would it ever have made sense politically. I'm not even just talking legally. This is such a particular moment. And I don't think it's something we should consider a new normal. I really don't. I think it's a combination of forces led to this moment now in some ways supercharged by the pandemic. And as we learn from Scripture, this too shall pass. But I do think on a system level, you're exactly right. It does not make sense that we empower a jury of everyday people, and this is why it is such a problem for Trump. It was not a judge. If it had been a single judge, particularly a judge appointed by a Democrat, then his conspiracy theories would be served. It was 12 everyday people from the same state he comes from who heard an immense amount of evidence on both sides and decided, and this is important, the public is smart enough to receive this, decided unanimously, which is the nature of our jury system, unanimously, in just 2 days, that he was guilty on 34 different counts. These specifics matter here. Had it been weeks of deliberation, or had it been what we call a hung jury where they couldn't come to result, or had it been a mixed outcome, guilty on a few counts, innocent on others, it would clearly be a different political result. But this result is so total that it now keys into what the polling has told us. And again, I'm the first to say we take all political polling, all public opinion research with much more cynicism now, much more questioning than we used to in the past. But we gain something from it. And what we saw in the research is that many Republican and independent voters said a conviction would matter to them. And it's the simplest reason in the world. They believe they are the bulwarks of law and order in America. These voters believe that they are protecting law and order. They do believe in the essence of the American system, and the jury system is, in a sense, the purest part of the American justice system. It's the part that isn't as susceptible to politics. It's a very high bar. 12 people have to agree unanimously, very high bar. I think this is one of the things that will turn the election. Enough of those independent and Republican voters who cannot bring themselves to vote for a convicted felon. Many of them will stay home. They won't vote for Joe Biden. Maybe they'll vote for a third-party candidate. But from the moment of that conviction, it's almost like their hand got paralyzed and they could not pull the lever for someone, because their entire lives they've believed if you're convicted of a crime, it means something.
Now I'd like to test a little bit your imagination, okay? Let's imagine, just imagine that Trump wins, okay? And let's imagine what would be the consequences for United States and for Brazil and Latin America and the whole world. We already know that Trump attempt against democracy. Everybody knows that he claimed, he asked for people to go to the Capitol that day. It's a fact. What do you think he would do against democracy if he's elected?
I think he'll try to, I mean, he's been very overt about his desire to, for example, remove the civil servants, the people who are part of government throughout, different administrations, the folks who are not political, to remove those that he disagrees with, to use the tools of the federal government for revenge against his enemies. He's laid his plans out very openly. The problem for Donald Trump is Donald Trump, that he, first of all, always overreaches and gives opportunity, legal opportunity and political opportunity, to those who oppose him, because he does things in such an extreme manner. But second, since 2016, Donald Trump single-handedly revived the grassroots strength of the Democratic Party, of the labor movement, of the progressive movement. There's never been a better recruiter for everyone in the center left than Donald Trump. And that's the reality now. If he were to win and attempted to subvert the democratic institutions, he would be met with a kind of public response and sort of organized grassroots response that would not have been possible 10 years ago. He actually gave people the tools, as it were. When you look around the United States, and I mentioned the issue of abortion, when you look around the United States and you see state by state the extraordinary efforts, particularly led by women activists, grassroots leaders, in states that are very conservative, who are able to win majorities for abortion rights because they were so highly organized and they were so deeply embedded in communities. If Donald Trump makes a move to subvert democracy, he's actually going to be I think, confronting a tsunami of opposition, unlike anything we've seen before. That's the first reality. Remember, our system only gives him 4 years. Constitutionally, he could not run again. The other fear that people have, is would there be any collusion with the military and law enforcement? And I actually think the opposite reality exists. I think I've gotten to know a lot of the American military leadership over the years, particularly during the COVID crisis. To use a phrase that was used to describe the dynamics at the time of Salvador Allende, the American military leadership are constitutionalists. They are, in many ways, offended by Trump. And I fundamentally believe the American military would never, truly believe, would never intervene on behalf of Trump. And even the law enforcement community, where he has certainly a lot of sympathy in elements of the law enforcement community, that same community also suffered on January 6, 2021 at the Capitol, and recognizes the danger from violent right-wing forces in America. Also, ultimately, especially at the leadership level, a constitutionalist group. So I think it would be a very difficult 4 years. But I think from the point of view of those of us who do believe in democracy, it would be about sustaining a resistance and a fight for 4 years and knowing that we can outlast him.
Let's imagine Latin America with Trump. We know that Americans played a very important role in our last election. Americans came, public officials came to Brazil to stress the importance of complying with the Constitution, the Brazilian Constitution, and that the United States would not support any attempt against democracy. Yesterday, we saw an attempt against democracy in Bolivia, an attempt of coup d'etat that failed.
Yes.
What would that be with Trump in office?
Look, I worry deeply about that. I mean, I think I'm obviously, I imagine, like everyone in this room, very gratified that attempted coup in Bolivia failed. But I think it failed because of domestic realities in Bolivia, not because of the role of the United States either way. Unfortunately, it's not a surprise to anyone in this room if the history of the United States and Latin America is not something we would ever want to repeat. I'm glad that in the case of Lula's most recent election victory that the United States was constructive. I'm glad in 1980 in Nicaragua the United States was constructive. There's a few examples of that, but very few. So the first thing I'd emphasize is there should be worry about a Trump administration and what it would do in Latin America, because it's most likely to pick up that history and try and continue it in the wrong direction, against democracy. But I also think the world is a very different place, thankfully. And shockingly, the decisions in most countries are made by the people in those countries, not by the United States Embassy anymore. And that's a very good thing. I don't know, and I'd be interested to know what people here think. I don't know what would have happened had the United States officials taken a neutral stance after Lula's victory, or if they had been actively opposed. I don't know what that impact would have been. I want to believe that we're at a point in history where, again, the United States has reached some limits in terms of its ability to negatively intervene. That may be a little idealistic on my part, but I want to believe that. But I think that the answer to your question is, no, if in a Trump victory, you should assume the worst of the American experience in Latin America returns. But I would also argue it might spark some of what it sparked in the United States of America, that if America aggressively, openly stands against democracy in Latin America, Latin American people will respond. And I think, one of the things we leave out of the equation too often is that the view of everyday people, and I would put it simply this way: no one likes to be dictated to. No one, in our own personal lives and in our political lives. We don't like to be dictated to. We especially don't like to be dictated to from someone outside our experience. And if the United States takes that interventionist viewpoint again, I think in many ways the interesting thing is what is the possibility it backfires and actually reinforces democracy.
We have a lot of tension in the world right now, political tension and military tension. We have wars. We have a war in Ukraine and we have a war in the Middle East. What do you think about the position of President Biden in the Middle East, his support to Israel, and how does that damage him in this election?
Look, I don't assume the damage part yet, and I'll tell you why. Put in context October 7th of last year, both from the point of view of Jewish Americans, who are a very, very important part of the Democratic Party coalition, especially in the key states that will decide the election. But far beyond that, the typical American voter, who obviously has got a certain level of interest and information because we do not have obligatory voting. I wish we had obligatory voting, but we don't. So the people who vote choose to vote. That tends to align to a somewhat higher level of information and interest. The typical American voter believes in the state of Israel as an idea. The typical American voter, deeply influenced by the history of World War II and everything after, in the belief that Jewish people were oppressed and need a homeland to protect them. So October 7th was an attack on that idea, and of course, on top of that, overtly terrorist and reminiscent of terrorist attacks that the United States has suffered directly. So it's not hard to understand that in the initial months, Joe Biden was actually perfectly aligned, I believe, with American public opinion. And I think he handled it correctly. I don't think anyone anticipated the counterproductive actions of Prime Minister Netanyahu, the sheer extent and the painful and truly disgusting level of civilian loss of life that obviously could have been avoided in Israel's response in Gaza. I think it took the Biden administration a while to fully realize how bad that situation was, because their origin of their viewpoint was sound. But the actions in the last month or two have been a course correction. I do think it's being felt in the United States. I think the Biden administration is sort of aligned both correctly diplomatically, but also more to where American public opinion is. So then the question is what happens in November, and my simple point would be, I think we have to separate out the people who are protesting, and I don't blame anyone for protesting, but the people protesting and never would be a part of the electoral process, versus those who might be. Are my statements too controversial? All right. Versus those who truly might switch their vote because of this issue. I today believe that's a relatively limited group of people. I also think we have a long time to the election. I mean, anyone who's worked in any kind of election would recognize that having a conversation in June about an election in November, I always tell people the election is a century away. It's so much will happen. So I think there's also time for a lot of the folks who do feel pained now to feel more comfortable coming back to Biden on a variety of other issues.
Trump has a somewhat obscure relation with Putin and Russia. What's going to happen in Ukraine if Trump wins? And what is the effect of that electoral win throughout Europe, where lots of elections promise to be tight between Democrats and right-wing candidates?
Look, that's simple answer, and I've one of the areas I care about deeply because of my origins is I care deeply about the reality of Italy and Italy's role in Europe. And I think it's safe to say after the European Parliament election that the idea of Europe, the sanctity of the European Union is strong. And it's strong for some philosophical reasons, but most especially practical reasons, because the average European likes it that way and does not want it taken away. Again, realize in politics how rare it is to have something taken away, and when you take something from people, there is a result. The problem for the far right is they rebelled against Europe, certainly in the case of Britain with Brexit. It backfired entirely. The British people obviously would go back to the European Union tomorrow if they could. But throughout Europe, I think we've seen, and this election a few weeks ago affirms it, there's a consensus among the people that the European Union is a good idea. That doesn't mean everything that happens in Brussels is they like, or the bureaucracy, but the European Union is a good idea. The right cannot overcome that. So if Trump were to win, he would boost those right-wing forces. It might have some impact in some particular elections, that's true. I certainly think, tragically, he would instantly come to a deal with Putin to give a big piece of Ukraine to Russia. I don't doubt that. I think he is likely to try to cut off weapons to Ukraine and to force an annexation of a certain amount of Ukraine by Russia. And I think it would be a horrible outcome. But I don't think Donald Trump can fundamentally change the reality of what everyday Europeans think. And I do think this last election and the elections we're about to see, particularly in Britain, remind us that the center-left still has quite a bit of life in Europe. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in France, where the left has unified in a way we haven't seen in a long time. I think this is such an important piece of the equation. And again, I come from the center-left, and that's my orientation. But I think the results in India, very different country, were shocking and affirming to what unity can do for the center-left. To some extent in Italy in the European election, the fact that there even is a unified group in France now, a new National Front, is quite shocking. I don't think Donald Trump stops all those things. I think Donald Trump in some ways encourages, again, more progressive forces to organize.
U.S. has virtually no unemployment right now. You have a very high unemployment rate, although President Biden was unable to implement lots of his plans and the things that he wanted to do in infrastructure, to create jobs, to inject money in the economy, precisely because there was a fight within the parliament. We experienced that in Brazil in probably the same extent. Do you think that our presidentialisms are outdated because of polarization, because of this fight between left and right that is so tight and reproduces society within parliament, and at the end it's not possible for the president to advance the country?
Yeah, clearly. I mean, the American federal government has been in some ways paralyzed for the last few decades because of this very reality, because we've so often had a split, one or the other house of our Congress in one party, presidency in another party. It's a highly questionable system in terms of forward motion. It's, the American founders wanted balance and wanted to avoid the country going back to monarchy. And they wanted to avoid extremes, and they wanted to avoid decisions that would alienate one region versus another. And they got their wish. In many ways it worked, except now it's almost like a caricature of that original vision, because now very, very little actually moves. So clearly what we need in many countries is either a political consensus in favor of some side of the spectrum so there can be a sustained period of getting something done, or we need to rethink our institutions. I think democracy by definition in an ever more complex, diverse, information-filled society, it's not surprising democracy would get harder. It really isn't. It means we have to approach it better. So I dream, I love the idea that there's a structural change. I'm not sure there is a structural change. I think there's a political change. I'm going to say it for my own country, from a democratic point of view, if we could get our voters to vote, it would be a very different country. And again, it may be hard to even hear that in a nation that has obligatory voting. But I've never doubted, if you look at that, this is where I think the public opinion polling is so overwhelmingly consistent that you can believe in it. What does a typical American believe? They strongly believe in the right for a woman to choose, with some qualification, but they strongly, a clear American majority right to choose, clear American majority for gun safety legislation. We obviously have a huge epidemic of gun violence. Vast majority of Americans want more control on weapons. Huge majority in favor of removing corporate money and the money of the wealthy from the political process. That's Democrats, Independents, Republicans, consistently across the board. Huge majority for higher taxes on the wealthy. These things are stunning, and yet our governing system doesn't represent those worldviews. And so I think, from a Democratic point of view, since we have the majority position on all those matters, we represent that the Republicans don't on each and every one of those. What are we doing wrong? That famous phrase that we have in English, I don't know if you have it in Portuguese, physician, heal thyself. So, that's my view of my own party. We have a lot of work to do ourselves within our own system. And if we do it, we actually have a majority we can tap into. And I want to say, speaking of tapping into, if you'd like to, at any point, welcome in the crowd, I'm ready.
Very good. Would it be fair to say that Trump and Biden has one thing in common, and that would be China? And China is an intimate enemy for both.
Yes, absolutely right. And that's been a powerful change in American politics that you're exactly right. It's funny when you see two administrations basically agreeing, even though they seem to disagree, and it has had a deep effect on American politics and for both parties. And I think it's because the current Chinese leadership has overplayed their hand so intensely on everything, on human rights, on Taiwan, on trade. And so, yeah, I think there's tremendous American frustration down to the grassroots with China. And but the fact is, it's important to understand politically that doesn't cut for one party or another electorally. It's interesting. I mean, you and I talked about the question of Russia, and now we should compare. For decades and decades, Americans were taught Russia, or really the Soviet Union at that point, was the enemy, the number one enemy, because sort of an article of faith. It was part of American culture. And that has faded away. Russia is an abstraction. Only because of the Ukraine war is there any feeling about Russia at all. But China is, you feel China's presence every day in America because of the economic reality. And there's a lot of resentment about that. It doesn't have a political manifestation, one party for the other, but it's an interesting form of consensus that as both parties have decided to be more and more aggressive towards China, that actually is appealing to the American people. And I think whether China wants to admit it or not, part of why so many companies around the world, for that and many other reasons, so many companies are now pulling back from China, moving manufacturing to Vietnam or Indonesia and many other places, Malaysia, all sorts of places. Very interesting that it seems like the Chinese leadership doesn't care that their, in my view, extremism is causing this really powerful multiplier effect.
Wonderful. What will be the role of gender, race, and sexual orientation in this election? Because this is a very strong thing here in Brazil that oppose people. And I believe it's somewhat the same in U.S. What would be the role of these issues?
Each of them obviously different. With sexual orientation, which once upon a time was an issue where there was tremendous division in the United States, and Republicans were very smart, unfortunately, about pointing to people's cultural fears and using that as what we would call a wedge issue, using that powerfully as a political tool. That's not possible anymore. And I think it's fair to say that there is tremendous fear in the LGBT community, the gay community, about where American law could be going under Trump, because the same rationale that led to the decision on abortion could be used to roll back the rights of gay people. So that's probably galvanized that constituency for Biden. When it comes to race, the Republicans historically racialize elections to try and win white votes. I think that's happening to some extent on their attempt to racialize the issue of crime, but it's not overly clear at this moment. Where the racializing is happening is regarding the border and the immigration situation, so it's not the traditional Republican attempt to paint the Democratic Party as too black. I think they're trying to paint the Democratic Party as too Latino now because of the border crisis. And I'm the first to say, I think, Democrats need to be more thoughtful about how to approach the border. I think to some extent, again, we've let some of this problem in ourselves. But so that is the area, I think, racially, where you're going to see a lot of tension in this election. The Biden administration more recently has taken actions that might reduce that, but that's a huge fault line in this election. The irony, besides the moral irony, a country that's supposed to be based in equality, obviously our founding documents are some of the greatest in human history on the question of equality, why there is such energy to reject immigrants from Latin America while we're also in the middle of a labor crisis. Because America, as I think people know, the United States of America has a declining birth rate, a full employment economy, and a deep need for labor. You'd think that wouldn't be the time to try and close the border. So we have an irony there, but there is a political power to that. But gender is really, to me, gender is the decisive issue. The election will hinge on gender. I believe this. I've said this for months. I believe it in my heart. Besides the fact that women vote more than men in our system, clearly vote more than men, there have been some elections in the United States, in certain states, where the percentage of voters that are women have approached 60%. So not just the natural demographic majority of women, but much, much more. So I think it's really important to understand women voters are motivated. The juxtaposition of the parties is almost perfect at this point. There is very little Republicans can say to women voters who are concerned about their rights. And I think this will decide the election. And it's too late for the Republicans to course correct on that. This is, sometimes it's like we have a wonderful phrase in English, the slow motion train wreck. Republicans have had a long time to try and figure out something they could say to women, and they have nothing. And they're in disarray on this issue because they can't decide a way back. They've painted themselves so extreme on the issue of abortion, they can't find a way back. And to make matters worse, in the state of Alabama, a law was passed against in vitro fertilization. And for many Americans, including conservative Americans, IVF is pro-family. It's a right that people believe they should have if they're struggling to have a family. So now Republicans have painted themselves as opposed to that as well, which I think is another factor that will be fatal to them.
Right now, you have the lowest murder rate in America, I think historically. What changed on regulation during Biden administration, and what could change if Trump wins?
Look, I think it's I want to give the Biden administration credit that, some gun safety legislation was passed, and it was an important step after decades of there being no progress on this issue. But really what happened was the pandemic ending. The pandemic, we in New York, I was mayor, for 6 years before the pandemic and then 2 years at the beginning of the pandemic. We had declining crime, declining murder. We had very, very aggressive strategies that were working. And then the pandemic deeply intensified gun violence. And this is something I think is not fully understood. We understand that people were desperate. We understand there was a lot of emotion. But why it led to such a precipitous increase in gun violence, I still don't think is fully analyzed. But America has come out of that by and large, and sort of reverting back to the pre-pandemic norm. I would say Biden can claim some credit for that. But that said, we have so much farther to go in terms of gun regulation. It's still a deeply unresolved issue, but one where I think the American public is starting to move, because I don't have enough context to understand your reality here, but I can speak to our reality. You know, the mass shooting is a norm in America now, and that is extremely upsetting, especially to parents, because so many of the mass shootings have been focused on schools. And that's where I think, sadly, you're going to see continued energy for more reform.
It's clear to me that a more lenient policy towards drugs decreased the amount of arrested people, black arrested people, young people, and decreased violence in the United States. But the images of addicted people on the streets and fentanyl, the K drugs, and even people smoking marijuana in most of American cities fuel the conservative speech. What is the role of this dispute on drugs for the American election?
Look, I think there's a consensus growing in America around marijuana. And certainly our experience in New York suggests that as you reduce unnecessary arrest, you reduce incarceration, you actually can do that in a way that brings down crime. We did that in New York. We reformed our marijuana laws, and we had a very, very purposeful focus to reduce incarceration, and our crime rates went down simultaneously. I also think for the American people, marijuana usage is so common that part of why the movement for legalization has gained such momentum is that it might as well have been legalized in reality. And I think you're going to see these laws acted on in a variety of states, and then eventually we'll get to the full federal legalization. And that will be healthy for our criminal justice system. The more dangerous drugs, fentanyl, et cetera, there is an opioid epidemic in America. It was exacerbated by the pandemic, but it continues to be very strong. I don't think there is a pure electoral ramification to that. I do think the Republicans tried to paint a picture of disorder writ large, and they take the opioid crisis and try and put that as a part of a many-piece puzzle of disorder, the border crisis being another part of it, for example. The protests on Gaza being a piece of it. This is a classic Republican strategy. It's why, as much as anything, Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election against the backdrop of protest and disorder. I do think there is an American impulse for order, whether it's healthy or not always. So I think the opioid crisis is a small piece of that equation. Much bigger will be going into the fall. What's the situation with crime? What's the situation with border? What's the situation with the Gaza protests?
I did not run out of questions, but I think that I should be a little bit generous and let our audience ask you some questions.
You are an egalitarian. Yes.
Ambassador, would you like to make
or
a question?
anyone.
Or anyone, but let's start.
Thank you so much. I'm sure I speak a little bit on behalf of everybody. That is amazing. It's what an honor and pleasure to hear and to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I would kindly ask you to make some kind of, let's try, we are, to certain, I believe in a closed environment. Of course, we have to touch the issue of foreign policy, because that's really where Brazil and the United States, even with the Biden administration, we still can find some space for disagreement.
Sure.
So I would kindly invite you to comment a little bit on the possibilities of making the United States understanding the position of Brazil, because It's not that we are against, we just have another inclusion in the world. So how do you see that? Our positions on this issue. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Ambassador. Look, I have long felt the United States takes a contradictory view on all of Latin America, and Brazil obviously being the most important piece of Latin America, that we want allegiance and support from Latin America, and yet we don't want to take the actions that would actually build that. So from my point of view, we could have a sort of enlightened American policy that says, as Brazil has become more and more of an important player in the global economy, that we want to truly support that and understand, as you said, that Brazil is going to have its own imperatives, its own needs, its own viewpoints, and that's normal. If we truly want an alliance, we have to act that way. I think we are still lost in the past. I don't think it's an even complex equation. I think we've marginally gotten better. But, you know, there was this very strange idea around some of the questions of immigration, that could we be constructive in addressing the root causes? And the answer, of course, is we could be constructive. That idea is not strange. Our approach is strange, that we see people coming into the United States from Venezuela or from Haiti or from Central America, nations in profound crisis, and we don't ask ourselves sufficiently, what did we do to help create that crisis? Because almost all of it has an American root, a root in North America. And what are we going to do to, if we really want to change that dynamic, to have a sustained policy for decades to change reality, which would start with a very strong pro-democracy approach. So I think, just without getting into a lot of detail, I think generally speaking, American foreign policy towards Latin America is lost in the past, is uncreative, is still not respectful enough of sovereignty. But to the extent it could be interventionist, there is a progressive, embracing, investing kind of interventionism, and we're not there either. It's almost like we're not the interventionists of the past, that were overtly anti-democratic. We're not enlightened interventionists working with each country to help them be as strong as they can be. We're somewhere in this confused middle.
Eu pediria para você se apresentar.
Claro. My name is Ivan Finotti. I'm from Folha de São Paulo. I have two questions, Mr. de Blasio. What's your role in Joe Biden's campaign? Are you officially a member of the team? And the other question is about the debate tonight. What advice would you give to Joe Biden now, today, for face Mr. Trump tonight?
Yes, I'm a member of the team in the sense of I am a surrogate speaker. I've been active in the state of Michigan, where I've been teaching at the University of Michigan. So I don't represent the campaign in the sense of being a paid member of the team or part of the leadership. I'm a supporter, and I've been actively trying to help the campaign as a supporter, as a volunteer. The advice tonight is very much like the State of the Union. Look, if Joe Biden could take the State of the Union address a few months ago and take some of the best lines out of that, because he had actually an extraordinary number of good messages in that address, and just repeat them consistently tonight, he wins the debate. I truly believe it. It's not just the message, it was the assertiveness and the aggressiveness. That night shocked people in a good way, because he owned the situation. He took his title and his ability to sort of dominate the room, and he absolutely played it out to the fullest. So tonight, I think he thankfully, it's very natural for him. He needs to be the President of the United States. He needs to be the person who's actually leading and gets to say, here are the things that I am doing and where we need to go. The campaign needs to keep talking about where we need to go. And obviously, people are very pained on the question of inflation. Biden administration has done amazing work on healthcare, for example, reducing medicine costs, reducing insulin costs. I think we need to hear more about that because that's an actual response to inflation. But otherwise, on the attack, on the offensive, say as many times as you can, Donald, you're a convicted felon. I would, if I were Joe Biden, I would say that 10 times tonight. Say as many times as you can, why did you take away a woman's right to choose? Because interestingly, some of the research says there are still a number of Americans who don't directly associate that decision with Trump, even though it could never have happened without him. So that's actually an opportunity area for Biden to amplify that. I think if he just stays on the offensive, he wins.
Hi, good morning. I am Rafael Balago from Exame Magazine. Mr. Blasio, continuing on the debate, Trump will probably attack Biden on immigration and inflation, and how Biden could respond, especially on the immigration topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I think you're right. I think that's going to be the hardest one. I think the response has to be visionary, meaning to say we can solve this problem with comprehensive immigration reform. Here's what I want to do. Will you join me, Donald? Because Trump will never be able to answer yes. I mean, the history here going back, you may remember George W. Bush attempted immigration reform and couldn't get his own party to come along. So I think Biden's best answer is to say, this is where we need to go. Are you going to join us or not? Because your party has never joined us. Are you going to join us or not? And at least neutralize. On inflation, I'd like to see him talk about the things that they have done, especially on healthcare costs. And remember, that's after housing, healthcare costs is the #1 concern for Americans. But I think that's another area where both go on the offensive of what he wants to do and say, will you join me? He did that during the State of the Union on Social Security and on Medicare, where Republicans have too often sounded like they might reduce those programs. So of course that's an opportunity for him to say, look, if you want to talk about inflation, let's talk about how to protect people's economic reality. We need to protect Social Security, we need to protect Medicare. Your party has been threatening to do away with it. Just by saying those words, he's winning right there. Talk about what he's done to reduce the costs on healthcare. But then the other thing is I would turn it to Trump's tax breaks for the rich and the corporations and say, you took money out of the pockets of working people and gave it to the wealthy. Biden's going to absorb some attacks. He's not always going to be able to, like any debate, he's not going to always have the perfect answer. He needs to counterattack every time. That's my view.
Perfect. I believe that there are many journalists willing to talk to you. And it seems so important for us that you talk to them because you will instruct our public opinion on all those subjects, not only people who are here. So I'd like you to make your final address. And I thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Well, I will conclude, first of all, with gratitude. You have been a kind audience to give me an opportunity to share some thoughts. And I hope you can hear that for me, it's from the heart. My concern for my country and knowing that my country has an impact everywhere, but also my hope. And so I'll conclude with a note of hope. I think none of us would have written this script. I never imagined Donald Trump or Trumpism in this form. And I've been active and involved in American politics for decades. If you had said to me, if you came to me on the first day of 2015 and you said, this is how this election's going to go, I would have said, you're crazy. So I want to be, like many people, we should be humble about what we didn't see or what we didn't understand. But what I did understand was people were extremely frustrated. That the average American feels their situation has gotten worse for many years. That the dream we had this American dream of each generation does well and then the next generation does better economically, that is very, very troubled right now. And in fact, for young people in America, my children are 26 and 29 years old, they do not start with the assumption that they will do better than their parents. They start with the assumption they will do worse than their parents. And that's typical all over the United States. In fact, many young people in their 20s, even into their 30s, are having to live at their family home because they can't afford their own home. And we see that in other parts of the world. We see that in Europe, for example, and other places where that notion that we were continuing to grow and we had upward mobility and inclusion has now been deeply troubled. The opportunity Trump took was to tap into that fear and that resentment, but in a very negative way. The counter opportunity is to tap into it in a positive way. I do think, as someone who supported Bernie Sanders in 2020, I think he saw some of the possibility of turning that frustration towards a different, more positive view. I do think there's more of that in the future. So I'm hopeful that the same underlying conditions could lead actually to a more progressive and inclusive vision of where our society could go. But the number one thing, and I'll conclude with this, is the sheer mobilization, the awakening of democracy that was ironically caused by Donald Trump. That sometimes we only value things when they are taken away or are about to be taken away. And I think for a lot of Americans, we did take democracy for granted. And we forgot the fact that you actually have to earn it in every generation. And I never would have wanted to tell you that Donald Trump would be the perfect messenger, but in this case, he was the perfect messenger by negative example. He awakened so many people and reminded them that they have to take ownership of their own society. This is why I actually believe in the end, American democracy will be strengthened, because once people actually feel that something belongs to them, they act differently. Now, all of us who are involved have much work to do. I'm sure that's true here as well. And every time I speak to an audience of influential people, I always say, do not forget your own ability to have an impact. That we have to always inspire people to remind them to be involved. That we have to lead by example. The good news here is, in the end, actually most people just want a decent society, a fair society, some measure of security. Most people are not asking for too much. And the beauty is you can have those things in a democratic context. And you can have rights and freedoms and the sense that you can live your own life. And that impulse, that right to live your own life as you choose, is extremely powerful. But in some ways, I think we forgot to emphasize to people what a beautiful thing that is and how horrible it would be if it was ever lost. Donald Trump reminded them. Now, for all of us in my country, we have a lot of work to do for the next 4 months. But I told you, I believe people will do that work. I believe they'll work exceptionally hard. And that's why I believe Joe Biden will be our president again next year as well. Thank you, everyone.